Steve Merrill joins us from Pro Sports Info to break down the lines each and every week in college football. And of course, nearing New Year's Day, we've got a ton of games to run down as the Power 5 conferences go at it. And a couple of Big Ten SEC matchups on New Year's Day highlight the day going into the major bowl games of the Sugar Bowl and the Rose Bowl later in the day. Speaking of Iowa and Mississippi State, with the Bulldogs bedded up now to what appears to be a full touchdown favorite over Iowa.
Yeah, 7-point favorite now across the board for Mississippi State. A total around 42.5. It's come down from 44.5. So this is one of the lowest over-unders we'll see the entire bowl season. It should be a defensive battle here. Obviously, Iowa, not an explosive team, but Mississippi State's defense, probably one of the most underrated units of anybody in college football this year. They quietly allowed just 12 points per game all season long and just 4 yards per play, despite losing 4 games. And what's crazy about that is their offense isn't bad. They average 400 yards per game offensively. If you were to just look at the statistical numbers, this would be a top 5, at worst top 10 team, maybe better than even Notre Dame. So I really like Mississippi State. I think they're flying under the radar this year. Iowa was really good on the road, 43 points a game, but I think that offense is going to struggle in this one against a very underrated Mississippi State defense.
All right, Kentucky, who given a little credit for the wins that they mounted throughout the season based on the Vegas lines, goes up against a Penn State team that's got a pretty big number here, going from about 4 points when the game opened to about 6 to 6.5 points right now for Penn State over Kentucky at the Citrus Bowl.
Yeah, it's right around 6.5, so it will be interesting to see if that momentum continues, and it hits a very key number, of course, of 7. We have a few days to go here. We'll see if that line continues to rise. Kentucky got off to that surprisingly strong start. They definitely faltered a bit down the stretch. In fact, despite going 9-3 straight up this year, they were just 5-7 against the number. Meanwhile, Penn State 9-3, a bit of a disappointing season for some, actually went 7-5 against the spread. So I think a lot of people would be surprised that at 9-3 for both squads, Penn State actually had the better spread record this year. I think that's one of the reasons we've seen that line climbing. They also finished the regular season with 3 straight wins. So after a 6-3 lackluster midseason mark, they did finish strong down the stretch. So I think they'll be excited to be in this game. And if they show up, I think they're the better team.
And here we have it, Steve. We've got Central Florida. And we know what they accomplished last year at the end of the season, running the table, then defeating a top SEC team. They get another crack at another top 2 to 3 SEC team in LSU, who finished 9-3. Central Florida, of course, undefeated. This game played out at the Fiesta Bowl, and LSU's a full touchdown favorite.
Yeah, Central Florida's got the better offense. Even with the quarterback change, no matter who's there, I think they're the better offensive team. LSU, very lackluster offensively. They might have put up 32 points a game this year, but they only averaged 5.4 yards per play against opponents that allowed 5.4. So an average offense from a yards per play perspective. Very good defensive team in LSU, so I do think that'll limit Central Florida. What's interesting is that the Knights actually defensively this year were better than they were last year, getting up just 21 points a game. But I think this will be one of the bowl games where both teams shoot the lights out and they score some points. Even though Central Florida has something to play for here, it's a huge step up in class. I think they will struggle to stop a mediocre, even SEC offense. They just haven't faced anything like this level of competition all year. Meanwhile, Central Florida also is at a disadvantage because LSU, I think, will be focused. You know, they might have been better off playing either Georgia or Ohio State, who could have been really flat for their bowl game after just narrowly missing out on the playoff. LSU was never really in that picture. They had that epic overtime loss against Texas A&M to finish the season. They've been off for about 5 weeks now, though, so I think both teams will be ready to play.
Speaking of which, we've got Ohio State and Georgia playing late on New Year's night. And, of course, the Buckeyes have advanced to the Rose Bowl as the Big Ten champion, narrowly missing the playoff, taking on the Pac-12 champion in Washington. These two teams have never played in postseason play, and the Buckeyes are about a 6-point favorite.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a big question is, does Ohio State show up with the motivation they would normally have for the Rose Bowl? I mean, this is a team that probably should have been in the Final Four. I actually had them slightly ahead of Oklahoma. Honestly, had Georgia ahead of both Oklahoma and Ohio State. And all these teams should have been ahead of Notre Dame if you're really looking for the 4 best teams. So Ohio State has to be a little bit disappointed, especially after that strong win against Michigan. They pulled away from Northwestern in the title game. They did what they had to down the stretch. But the fact remains, this is not a good defensive team. On the season, they gave up nearly 6 yards per play. So this should be a shootout. And if they do come in a little flat, I think, once again, that shows on the defensive side of the ball. Washington, although only averaged 26.5 points a game, they averaged over 6 yards per play. They're more than capable of putting some points up against a mediocre Ohio State defense.
Joined by Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. Steve joins me on a regular basis during the college football season, and of course, we're taking it on through postseason play and arriving at the final game before the national championship game on New Year's night. And Steve, if we're just looking at matchups and going to strip away the traditional tie-ins to the bowl games, it would have been a whole lot of fun, I think, to see Ohio State and Georgia play, and Washington could have played Texas. But instead, we've got a Texas team that played a decent Big 12 championship game. They were in it against Oklahoma until the final 4 or 5 minutes and lost by 12, taking on a Georgia team that, of course, if you're just going by the eye test, took care of business throughout the season, excluding the loss at LSU, and then they show up and outplay Alabama for most of the game before losing by a touchdown. Georgia, a 13-point pick by Vegas over Texas.
Yeah, and this is showing you how good Georgia is, that the fact the point spread is this big. Georgia was my third best team in the nation behind Alabama and Clemson, even after the loss to Alabama. I don't downgrade a team for outplaying the best team in the country and then losing on a neutral field. Notre Dame, obviously, it went a win, loss, perfect season, no losses. I understand how they had to put them in the playoff. But Georgia's much better than Notre Dame. They're better than Oklahoma and Ohio State. The problem is that you just don't know the mindset of this team right now. I could definitely understand if they come in this game a bit discouraged and not quite focused. Meanwhile, Texas, although they did lose their conference title game as well, as you mentioned, they realized, at 9-3 going into that game, they weren't playing for anything. Now at 9-4 as a 13-point dog. This is the makings of one of those double-digit dogs that can win outright. Georgia's the much better team, but if they don't come focused, Texas could definitely be competitive in this game.
And one of their best players, DeAndre Baker, announced yesterday that he will be not suiting up for the Bulldogs and preparing for the NFL draft. Steve Merrill, Pro Sports Info. Again, it's just not college football, but the NFL, Major League Baseball, of course, during the season, college basketball, and the NBA. So check him out right there at prosportsinfo.com. Steve, we appreciate you wrapping up the bowl season for us.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Well, do you think, let's see, this would be on, let's see, these games are on Tuesday, right? The New Year's Day games? Is that when?
Yes, the first, yeah.
Do you want to do the 2 playoff games, and we'll give those to SG1 Sports?
Yeah, that's fine.
And maybe we can give them the 3 later New Year's Day games: LSU, Central Florida, Washington, Ohio State, Texas, Georgia. Those seem to be the 3 biggest games.
Yeah, do that as a separate one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
I'll shoot them the playoff rip. Okay, very good. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, teaming up with SG1 Sports to bring you insight and information regarding the betting lines for college football each and every week throughout the season. And of course, in postseason play, it gets to be a whole lot of fun in matching up the Power 5 conferences in particular. And for Saturday night, of course, the championship's on the line as the 2 semifinals are played in Dallas and Miami. We got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info, who's just provided tremendous analysis for us each and every week. Steve, let's dive into the 2 big games, although the point spreads are huge. Alabama and Oklahoma, the nightcap at the Orange Bowl, with the Tide opening as a 2-touchdown favorite, and certainly the public has backed that up at 14 points.
Yeah, historically speaking, Mark, these semifinal games over the last 4 or 5 years since we've had them have not been competitive. We normally see double-digit wins. They have not been many, down to the wire type games. So if there's ever a season where we're not going to probably see it again, you would think it'd be this year with 2 nearly 2-touchdown favorites. Alabama's definitely the best team in the country. In fact, the look-ahead line right now is Bama minus 7.5 over Clemson. So against the second best team in the country, they're still going to be more than a touchdown favorite on a neutral field. That's how good Alabama is. Yet I think this game has the tendency or the potential to be a little bit closer of the 2 games just due to the fact Oklahoma is so explosive offensively. I think they can trade points, and I think they can also have some backdoor cover potential, which is something you look for when you're taking a 2-touchdown dog. Sooners have scored 28 points or more in every game the past 2 seasons. Now, obviously, they have not faced a defense at the caliber of Alabama. But what gets lost also, though, I think, is how good Alabama's offense is. Yes, Oklahoma averages 49.5 points a game, but Alabama's averaging 48 points a game, yet their defense is giving up 17.5 points per game less. That's the big edge here. question mark for me, though, is how healthy quarterback Tua is for the Alabama Crimson Tide. If he's fully healthy or even close to it, he should dominate against subpar defensive opponents this year, like Oklahoma. Tua has 21 touchdowns, no interceptions, and he averages over 14.5 yards per pass attempt. So I think both these teams can trade some points. It'll be a shootout. Total is 77 for a good reason. And if that's the case, I think Oklahoma actually has a better chance of the two big dogs to maybe keep it close.
Then, Steve, of course, we've got the opener of the two games in Dallas. Clemson taking on Notre Dame. The public certainly has a lot of confidence in the Tigers as this game opened around 10.5 points, and it's been bet up to 12.5 points in favor of Clemson.
Yeah, we did see the line drop a little bit recently from 13 down to 12.5. Dexter Lawrence, the great defensive tackle for Clemson, is out, a failed drug test. I think this might be a bit of an overreaction, though, because normally that would be a huge loss for a team. But Clemson is so deep and talented on that defensive line, there might not be as much of a drop-off as people think. Yes, the Tigers averaged 1.7 yards per rush, allowed 1.7 with them in there. They allowed 3.0 without them. But then again, some of that was probably garbage time when the backups were in the game. Huggins, the backup, who's going to get the majority of the makeup time, he's an NFL prospect as well. So this is a very stout defensive line for Clemson no matter what. And Notre Dame, unlike Oklahoma, is not a great offensive team. They average 34 points a game, but the opponents they played allowed 28 on average. They averaged 6.2 yards per play against teams that allowed 5.7. Clemson allows just 4.1 and 13.5 points a game. So their defensive numbers are almost twice as good as the average schedule that Oklahoma played, or that Notre Dame rather played this season. So for that reason, if Clemson gets up big early, I think Notre Dame could have some trouble playing from behind. If you're looking for one of the two games in which a team wins by double digits, as normally happens in these semifinal games, I just think Clemson's probably the safer pick to be a double-digit winner.
Yeah, last year we got one of the few gut-wrenching down-to-the-wire games with Georgia and Oklahoma going to overtime at the Rose Bowl, but for the most part, blowouts in games that were expected to be close for the most part during the college football playoff era. And Clemson, again, a 12.5-point pick against Notre Dame. We encourage you to join Steve over at prosportsinfo.com. You've got the NBA, college basketball, the NFL going toward the playoffs themselves, and, of course, the college football bowl games to wrap up the season. Steve, we appreciate the time.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. And if you're good for one more rip, we'll do those 3 New Year's Day games.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, teaming up with SG1 Sports to provide you insight into the betting lines from Vegas each and every week during the college football season. And we're not stopping now as we conclude all the big games on New Year's Day on through the playoffs, of course, a few days earlier to championship night on January 7th. And the way to do it is to bring in Steve Merrill from prosportsinfo.com. That's prosportsinfo.com, where you can catch not just college football insight, but information regarding the NFL, the NBA, and college basketball. All right, Steve, let's check out the 3 big games on New Year's night. We've got a very intriguing matchup, of course, because of the storylines of Central Florida's winning streak, playing in the group of 5, not playing as difficult a schedule, and now, again, facing an SEC power fresh off of accomplishing the win against Auburn at the Peach Bowl last year. Can they do it again? Well, Vegas is telling us that LSU is 7 points better, and that's the matchup at the Fiesta Bowl.
Yeah, it's sitting right on that key number of -7. It was as high as 8 earlier. There are some 7.5s out there, so it's been dropping. Be interesting if it continues to drop. I think the public might give Central Florida some love come game time. It's a little bit early to look at the public consensus. Right now, it's looking about 50-50. But I think an undefeated dog getting a full touchdown will be appealing to the public. But LSU, a very good defensive team. Central Florida's offense has not faced anything like this season. But this is still a great Central Florida offense. Even without Scott Frost at the helm anymore, this team put up 44 points a game. They were actually better defensively this year than the years past. LSU very good defensively as well. But sometimes in these late bowl games when teams have been off for a long time, the defenses don't quite pick up that intensity. I do think Central Florida will play with a chip on their shoulder, being undefeated, wanting to prove something. But this is a huge step up in class against a very good LSU squad.
We have the Rose Bowl not part of the college football playoff this year. Therefore, we've got a traditional Big Ten and Pac-12 championship matchup with Washington and Ohio State. Of course, the Buckeyes were hoping that their final run against Michigan and Northwestern would get them to the college football playoff. It did not. Washington coming into the game from a bit of a different angle, in which they dropped games mid-season, rallied late, beat Washington State to get to the Pac-12 championship game, then for the most part controlled the game against Utah to emerge as what we anticipated would be the best team in the Pac-12. Washington, Ohio State, the Buckeyes about a 6-point favorite.
Yeah, and you wonder about the mindset for Ohio State. Are they a bit disappointed about being left out? I thought they had a good case to make to maybe leap over Oklahoma as that fourth team in, although I felt Georgia was better than all the teams. With that said, Washington never really expected to be in the title game, but they're still a dangerous 10-3 team, a huge defensive edge. They give up 16 points a game. Ohio State gives up 26 points a game, but a huge difference yards per play wise. Washington allows just 4.6 yards per play. Ohio State allows nearly 6 yards per play. And even that, despite winning those final 5 games down the stretch, they still gave up 24 points or more in 4 of those 5 games. The only game in which they didn't was against a terrible Michigan State offense. So I do think Ohio State's defense is very suspect. And Washington averaged 6.1 yards per play this year. They didn't put up a lot of points, but they can move the ball, and they should have success in this game against a questionable Ohio State defense, especially if the Buckeyes are not fully focused.
So, Steve, as you know, the committee is charged to select the 4 best teams, and everyone has their opinion on that. You have metrics to back up your opinion. Who are the 4 best, and then extending past that, like the 6 or 7 best out of the contenders for the college football playoff? How do you have them ranked based on your numbers?
Yeah, there's no question the top 3 teams are Alabama, Clemson, and Georgia. Georgia is better than everybody else in the country except for Clemson and Alabama. And then despite the fact they outplayed Alabama for the majority of the game on a neutral field and lost, they should not have been bumped down. Notre Dame, for example, is only about 7th right now in my power ratings. I think the most underrated team in the country is probably Mississippi State this year, a team that allowed just 12 points a game. And once again, Georgia, an SEC team from the toughest conference. So it should have been Georgia, Clemson, Alabama with no doubt. After that, it's a pretty murky area. I've got a bunch of teams that all fit that mix. I have no problem with Notre Dame running the table against a decent schedule and making it. Power rating-wise, they'd be a slight underdog probably to Ohio State and Oklahoma. I think that's pretty much even which team you throw in there. But, yeah, Georgia was definitely the team that got screwed over this year by not making the Final Four.
So based on the numbers, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia for sure, and then there's a good argument between Oklahoma and Ohio State.
Yeah, I've got those 2 even, and I think Notre Dame's only about a point or 2 behind them. And I'll be honest, just picking them, I probably would put Notre Dame in. They ran the table. They didn't play the same tough schedule, but They beat who they had to beat. And we're talking about less than a field goal difference. And like I just said with Ohio State, they give up 6 yards per play. They gave up 24 points or more in 4 of their last 5 wins. They're not a good defensive team. It's hard to imagine that they're a national caliber, national championship team this year. Yet Oklahoma's the same problem. They're an explosive offense as well, but their defense is suspect. So I really think Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Ohio State, any of those teams in the Final Four made sense, but Georgia definitely should have been there.
So, yes, so we do have UGA. The Bulldogs, when they were on their game, they outplayed Alabama for 3.5 quarters. We know what they're capable of doing. Basically the same team. Sure, there's personnel differences, but the team that went and took Alabama to overtime at the national championship game last year. This is a dominant football team with elite athletes. A 13-point favorite in the Sugar Bowl against the Texas team that obviously is on the right track under Tom Herman, but maybe not quite ready for this game if everybody's got their heads in the game.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia, no question, they're a really good team. But here again, handicapping is more than just the numbers. You have to look at the emotional side of things. And handicapping the bowls, that's probably the number one thing you have to look at is motivation and mindset. And I would definitely be concerned about Georgia's mindset in this game. I'm sure they realize they should be playing in the national semifinals instead of this bowl game. If they show up, they can definitely win this game by double digits. Easier said than done, though. And this has the makings of one of those 13-point dogs that surprises because Texas is a sleeky good team this year. If you remember, we did our preview show this summer. Texas was one of my sleepers to be in the Final Four playoff, and they came close. They had a couple losses during the season that kind of knocked them out early, but they still beat Oklahoma in the regular season, one of the 4 playoff teams, and now they're taking on technically a non-playoff team. So no question they're capable of keeping this close, and even their second game, they only lost by 12 to Oklahoma. So they stayed within this number in both games against Oklahoma. No reason why they can't do it against Georgia, especially if Georgia isn't fully focused.
All right, Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. The conversation is tremendous each and every week with Steve to get his insight, not just in the game by game, but if you check out some of the old videos, just really breaking out down philosophies and approaches and concepts regarding trying to beat Vegas on these college football games, and as we take it through the NFL playoffs as well. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, I think we did some work there.
Good job.
And I'll carve that up for 3 different videos.
Sounds good. Do you have a can you email me the audio link?
Yeah, sure.
I'm gonna promote that in some emails and stuff too.
Absolutely.
Sounds good.
All right.